Hey guys, I'm Tom the Tech Chap, and as you can see, here it is, the new RTX 3080 from Nvidia. Is this worth buying? So, to help you out, if you are thinking about upgrading, I mainly want to see how the 1080 versus the 2080 versus the 3080 compare and, have a look at that 3-generational difference to see what kind of improvements we're getting and obviously then if it's worth upgrading. But as well as that, I'm also including the 1080 Ti and also the 2080 Ti, which was the previous flagship $1,200 card, just to give us a bit more context about how this new card performs. But let's start high level, and after averaging all my results, how does the 3080 compare with the 1080 and the 2080 overall? Well, starting with the 1080 and in rasterized, meaning regular non-ray trace games because the GTX series don't really support it, the 3080 is a massive 191% faster at 4K. And if you're coming from a GTX 1080 and you play at 1440p, which I think is pretty common, you can expect almost 2.5 times the performance. And then finally at 1080p, the 3080 is about twice as fast as the 1080. But what about versus the RTX 2080? Well, in rasterized games, we'll come to ray tracing in a second, the 3080 averaged 39% higher FPS at 1080p and almost 60% more at 1440p and 4K. Sticking with 4K, this time with RT on in supported games, I saw a massive 89% boost. But that's high level. Let's dive a little bit deeper and see how this performs in each game. And where better to start than with the new PC melting champ? It's not a case of, but will it run Crysis anymore, but will it run Flight Simulator 2020? I mean, fair enough, this game looks amazing, especially at 4K on Ultra, which is what I've tested here. But importantly, frame rate totally depends on the terrain and the weather conditions. If you're up high, away from the cities, then I saw 60 FPS at 4K with the 3080. But I also saw as low as 30 FPS over cities. I think if I can ask Nvidia for one thing for Christmas, it would be a DLSS patch for Flight Sim. But to keep things fair, I've been using the same landing challenge to test each card, so the 3080 gives us a 56% improvement compared with the 2080 at 4K. The performance difference versus the 2080 Ti isn't anywhere near as significant, but then remember the Ti was a $1,200 card, whereas this is a $700 card. The 2080 and the 1080 offer enough performance for an enjoyable experience at 1440p though. And even the older 1080 is fine at 1080p on Ultra. Though interestingly, the 3080 actually doubles the 1080's performance at 1080p. So how do you get 4K 60 with a 3080 at 4K in Flight Sim? Well, I had to drop down from Ultra to high-end settings and also reduce the terrain detail to get me a solid 60, and to be honest, image quality was still great. Alternatively, dropping the internal render slider down to 80 had the same effect and meant I could stay using Ultra settings. Okay, next up, Rainbow Six Siege, and this is kind of at the opposite end of the spectrum to Flight Sim because Siege runs really well on pretty much all modern GPUs. So the 3080 is total overkill here, and the numbers are just insane. It is a whopping 65% faster at 4K versus the 2080 and 36% faster at 1440p. Although at 1080p, we can see that both the 2080 Ti and the 3080 are being bottlenecked by the CPU. Next up, we have Call of Duty, which I've tested in rasterized mode, as while it does have a ray trace shadow mode, it's kind of a performance hog. To be honest, I can't wait to play the upcoming Black Ops Cold War though, as that gets proper RT as well as DLSS support. Anyway, at 4K Ultra settings, the 3080 is 46% faster than the 2080 and over 150% faster than the 1080. But it's also a good deal faster than the 2080 Ti, and not just at 4K. But the GTX 1080 is definitely starting to show its age here, and once again we see that in purely rasterized games, the 2080 wasn't really that much of an upgrade over the older 1080 Ti. Okay, moving on to our first DLSS supported title, Death Stranding. This uses the much improved DLSS 2 technology, and given this is only supported on 20 and now 30 series cards, this is where we start to see them really pull away from the 10 series. So turning on DLSS renders the game at a lower resolution and then upscales it using an intelligent AI and Nvidia's Tensor cores, which is less demanding than rendering natively. It makes very little difference to image quality, so if you have the option to use it and could use the extra frame rate, and why wouldn't you, then I don't see any reason not to use DLSS 2. To be fair, this isn't technically an apples to apples comparison with the 10 series, but rather comparing the reality of how you'd probably use this card with DLSS turned on. So the 3080 is an absolute monster here, especially at 4K and 1440, although it looks like it's bumping into CPU limits at 1080p. So the 3080 is 50% faster than the 2080 at 4K, both with DLSS on, and almost enough to max out my 4K 144Hz monitor. But how about Wolfenstein Youngblood, which is another game with DLSS, but also ray tracing? Well, to get some context, let's look at regular rasterization first, and like Rainbow Six Siege, the numbers here are kinda crazy. So this is with DLSS enabled, but it's the 4K RT numbers that really stand out here. And as you can see, the 3080 delivers over 2 times the frame rate versus the 2080. It's even 45% faster than the 2080 Ti, that was a $1,200 card. Okay, next up, Control, and this game has definitely grown on me over time, and it's a good demonstration of both DLSS and ray tracing. But starting without ray tracing, but with DLSS on the 20 and 30 series, the 3080 is 60% faster at 4K than the 2080, and 5 times faster than the GTX 1080, which is quite a lot. But ray tracing does make quite a big visual difference, so if we turn it on and then use its high setting across all resolutions, we see a pretty significant 40% drop in frame rate across the board. With ray tracing, not even the mighty 3080 can hit 4K 60, although it's still way faster than the 2080. Just for fun though, I also ran this on the 1080 and the 1080 Ti at 4K, and well, we're getting 3 and 4 FPS apiece, so not exactly playable. Next up, we have Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and here the 3080 is almost 70% faster at 4K than the 2080, 74% faster at 1440p, and around a third quicker at 1080p. It's also almost 2.5 times faster than the 1080 at both 4K and 1440p. So if it's 144Hz 1440p you're playing at, then only the 3080 will manage with maxed out settings. And switching on RT also turns on DLSS, which explains why performance actually goes up compared with regular 4K. And we're looking at about a 55% performance boost with the 3080 versus the 2080. But next up, let's talk about Minecraft RTX. And to be honest, ray-traced Minecraft sounded ridiculous to me until I saw the difference it makes, which is pretty astonishing. Now, there are only select RTX enabled levels for now, but they look amazing, and you do need a 20 or 30 series card. You also really need RT with DLSS turned on here, because ray tracing alone brings even the 3080 to its knees. So with DLSS as well, this is what Nvidia have probably been waiting for me to say, but the 3080 with ray tracing and DLSS turned on is around twice as fast as the 2080 at all 3 resolutions. The 2080 Ti is still a very capable card here, but the 3080 is still around 50% faster at each resolution. So that was going to be all the games I was going to test for this video until a couple of days ago, midway through this review, and Epic Games released an update for Fortnite, which added support for RT, so ray tracing and DLSS. And considering Fortnite, I think, is a reasonably popular game, I've definitely heard of it, I thought with the 3080 it would be definitely worth a quick test. At 4K with RT on, the 3080 is a whopping 90% faster than the 2080, nearly twice as fast. But having DLSS on is an absolute must here. But if you do want a solid 4K 60 with RT, then you'll definitely need a 3080. A bigger deal for me though is the inclusion of DLSS, which can be enabled without RT. And setting it to performance mode on the 3080, this basically doubled my frame rate at 4K, enough to max out my 144Hz screen. At 1440p and then 1080p, it boosted my FPS by 68% and 44% respectively. And I'd expect similar percentage boosts on the 20 series as well. As for thermals, I never saw this card go above 74 degrees Celsius in both my Furmark and 3DMark time spy loading tests, which is actually 9 degrees cooler than the 2080 Ti and 3 degrees cooler than the 2080. So not a major difference between these two, but versus the Ti, this is significantly cooler and, as we've seen, also significantly faster, which is pretty impressive and just shows how effective this new cooling solution is with the top and bottom fans. This whole card is basically just one big heatsink, and as we've seen, it seems to work really well. So bringing in the 2080, and as you can see, while it's a similar width, it is a good deal taller. It's about 18 millimeters taller, and it's also a little bit thicker. So it's a big card, and as soon as we start to see these third-party cards with big triple fan coolers on top, then yeah, it's going to be a 3-slot card. We also get this new 12-pin power connector, so you actually need to use this splitter, which just plugs in there, and then you've got your 2 8-pin connectors on the end. You always have this kind of ugly braided black cable hanging off your graphics cards. So aesthetically, while I think this is a gorgeous looking card, that takes away just a little bit from it, I think. As for ports, we get 3 DisplayPort 1.4As along with a single HDMI 2.1, which is actually pretty crucial because that means that you can now plug it into monitors and probably right now more likely TVs that support 2.1 and get full 4K, 120, 144 Hertz, even 8K at 60. So that HDMI port is probably what you're going to want to use in the future. Although right now, for most people, there are very, very few 2.1 monitors out there. You're probably going to want to stick with DisplayPort. So by now, I've probably bored you all to death, so I won't go into too much detail about some of the bonus features you get with the new 30 series cards, such as RTX I/O, also their reflex technology. I'll save those sort of extra features for a bit more of a deep dive video when I make my buying guide. So when I get the 3070 and also the 3090, I want to do a big sort of triple graphics card test to find out which one you should actually buy. And I think in that video, we'll dive a little deeper about what those new features mean as well. But the takeaway from this video is that this guy, the 3080, is a true generational leap forward in graphics performance and crucially at the same price point. So versus the 1080, this is about 3 times faster at 4K, about 2.5 times faster at 1440p, and about twice as fast at 1080p, which I think in anyone's book is a solid upgrade. Versus the 2080, this guy is about 58% faster at 4K in traditional rasterized games, but a whopping 89% faster when playing games that support RT. So I really hope you found this video useful, and I guess the big questions going forward are, how is this going to compare with AMD's big Navi, the RX 6000 series, which we'll see towards the end of October. I can't wait to compare that. And also, of course, Nvidia's 3070, 3090, and maybe even the 3060, which they've rumored to be coming up with as well. I can't wait to see if maybe they are, you know, better value options, because I think for most people, this is just overkill. So I think maybe the 3070 will be the one to go for, which costs about 200 less. Thank you so much for watching, guys, and make sure you do hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on my next video, including my full RTX buying guide coming soon as well. So make sure you stay tuned, and I'll see you next time right here on the Tech Chat.